Welcome to today's session on discussing descriptive question of RBI's mains examination. Today, we'll be discussing a 15 marker question. So, the question for today's session is, what are all India financial institutions? Discuss their role in Indian economy. What are Basel norms framework introduced by RBI for all India financial institutions? So before we discuss the answer, let's do some groundwork so that our understanding of the topic increases and we deliver as per the demand of the question. So this question has three subparts. So we'll divide our answer accordingly. So in introduction, we'll write about what are AIFIs. Then in body of the answer, first we'll write about the AIFIs that are regulated by RBI, which are namely Exim Bank, NABARD, NHB, SIDB, and NEPFED. Then we'll discuss the role of AIFIs in Indian economy. Then we'll move to Basel norms framework. Now let's first understand the present situation of AIFIs in terms of regulation. So we'll divide this screen to two parts, where first we'll talk about what is the current regulation of AIFI and what are the revised ones. Right. Let's divide this screen. Here we'll write about current regulation. Here basically we are talking about before Basel 3. Here it is revised regulation Basel 3. Right. So currently AIFIs are governed by Basel 1 capital requirements. Basel 1 capital requirements. So here they are required to maintain a minimum total capital of 9%, and it is of risk weighted assets, right? And in this total capital, tier 1 capital should be 4.5%, and tier 2 capital should not exceed 50% of total capital. All right. So these were the norms before Basel 3 was introduced in AIFIs by the RBI. Now RBI has decided to leapfrog to Basel 3 norms, and this is seen as a positive move by the market. So let's talk about what are these Basel 3 norms. So here in Basel 3 norms, total capital would be 9% of risk-weighted assets. Here, tier 1 capital would be 7%. And this tier 1 capital is further classified into common equity tier 1, common equity tier 1, which holds 5.5%. Another would be additional tier 1, which holds the remaining 1.5%. All right. So tier 2 capital would hold how much? Since the total capital requirement is 9% and we have tier 1 capital of 7%, so tier 2 capital would be 2%. So here in Basel III norms, there is an introduction of capital conservation buffer. And this buffer would be 2.5%. And another would be counter cyclical capital buffer. Counter cyclical capital buffer. And it will hover around 0 to 2.5%. And this would be based on the guidelines issued by the central bank. So, as we know, in Basel III, there are three pillars. First one would be capital adequacy requirements. So, this whole thing that we discussed here would come under capital adequacy requirements, right? Other two pillars besides capital adequacy requirements, that would be what? Supervisory review. And other would be market discipline. It would remain the same, right? So now that we have cleared what are the capital adequacy requirements that have been suggested by the central bank to AIFIs, let's move on to the answer of the question. So we'll start our answer with the basic introduction. Like AIFIs are specialized financial institutions operating at national level. So they are responsible for providing long-term finance, promoting industrial growth and fostering economic development. Then we'll discuss each of the AIFIs with giving one-liner production, or one-liner description about them, about what they do, what kind of sector they finance, right? So next comes the role of all India financial institutions in the Indian economy. So here we have written some points like they are responsible for long-term financing. Here we'll write they support infrastructure projects, industrial expansion, capital investments in various sectors, right? Second point we have written sector specific focus. So here sector specific focus we can write channeling targeted sectors results in utilizing resources efficiently and promoting sectoral development, innovation and competitiveness. Right. Next, we'll write about risk mitigation. Here in risk mitigation, we can write about that their help in financing would provide credit enhancements, guarantees and risk sharing mechanisms. So overall risk can be reduced because of their long-term financing nature. Next, we can talk about developmental mandate. So these financial institutions are mandated to promote inclusive growth, regional development, and sustainable livelihood. All right. So they support priority sectors, backward regions, and marginalized communities through their targeted investment programs. Next, we will write about policy support. So these financial institutions not only provide policy inputs, they also help in implementation process also. All right. Next comes the third part of the answer, that would be Basel norms framework. All right. So here we will give some basic definition of Basel norms. Then we'll move to key components of Basel III norms that have been advised by the RBI to AIFIs. So here we'll discuss capital adequacy requirements. And I think we have discussed this in our first slide, how they are different. Only thing new here to remember is these are to be enforced by April 2024. And for National Housing Bank, the implementation date is July 2024 because of their accounting year, right? Next would be risk management. So here central bank has capped all India financial institutions investment in capital instruments of banking, financial and insurance entities at 10% of their equity, right? And in this also they have written, they have advised or they have given guidelines that AIFIs are not allowed to acquire fresh stake in any other AIFIs or bank share if their acquisition exceeds 5% of their equity. All right. Next comes asset classification and provisioning. So under this, for the purpose of capital adequacy, all the financial subsidiaries are need to be accounted. But here the exception has been given for insurance and non-financial activities. All right. Next comes disclosure and transparency. Here the central bank has advised for effective and efficient capital planning as well as long-term capital maintenance. Next comes supervisory oversight. So RBI as a supervising body, it conducts periodic inspections, audits and reviews of AIFI's operations that ultimately helps to ensure compliance of its guidelines and it safeguards financial stability. Then we'll conclude our answer. Here we'll talk about that such measures will help strengthening our financial sector. So it could withstand shocks and it could support sustainable growth and development of the country. So this completes our 15 marker question. Thank you for listening. Have a nice day.